Crioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 224, From the Pub to the Ohio Valley. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Ohio was a territory mostly known for how isolated it was and being on the brink of what at that point would be considered the United States' frontier. It was relatively unsettled. There were only a few forts in the area, and much of the territory was consumed with dealing with the day-to-day battles that were going on in taming a relatively untamed area of the country. Now, this doesn't mean there weren't settlements. There were native communities there. There were French traders and settlers there at some points. But the valley was, by comparison, certainly to today, a small and isolated place. Nothing like the Midwestern industrial and farm powerhouse of the 20th century, or its current state as the center of what is now called the Rust Belt. No, this was nothing like that. Even for settlers coming from Britain, it was an unfamiliar place. Over time, settlers arrived through the end of the Revolutionary War, and by 1798, the first fort was established in what would be called Marietta. Within a few years, more settlers began to arrive, and with them came the subject of our podcast, and this episode specifically, Welsh settlers. The first Welsh settlers were originally from Pennsylvania. They were members of the Welsh settlements there. They were either first-generation Welsh people who moved to Pennsylvania, or in some cases, people who were second and even third-generation Pennsylvania settlers who now moved to Ohio. This was something that was happening as America started to spread west. More and more, their own community of settlers would start to move that way, and it would create this idea that there was a need to move west in order to find land, a desperate search for land as populations became more and more embedded in the East Coast areas that were the original 13 colonies. The foundations for the first Welsh settlement in Ohio was laid on June 29, 1881, when William and Morgan Gwilym purchased land from what is now Morgan Township at the Cincinnati Land Office. The township was named after General Daniel Morgan for his victories in the Revolutionary War. He too was a Welsh descendant. Morgan, last name kind of gives it away, from the colony of Virginia. Settlement in the area became known as Paddy's Run, started around 1802, a year before Ohio became the 17th state. The land was then in Hamilton County, and at one point during the history of the area, it was given the name Glendower, in honor, of course, of Owen Glendower. It may have been pronounced Glendower, for all I know, but, force of habit, I correct for that. It was then, rather unoriginally, called New London, and eventually received its current name of Shandon. Calvinist Methodists families left Cardiganshire and founded the Welsh Hills settlement near Newark, Licking County. The community had its origins in an incident in Carmarthen, where in 1787, John H. Phillips, son of a wealthy man in the area, allegedly wrote a pamphlet criticizing the British government for its lack of religious reform and emigrated to America to avoid punishment. As you can imagine, there was not a lot of tolerance to having religious differences even at this point. He would then go on and sail to Philadelphia with his two brothers, and Philip settled near the city and met up with other Welsh settlers who obviously lived in this vicinity of Pennsylvania. One, the chaplain for the General Anthony Wayne, procured Phillips an appointment on the general's staff. The sons then wrote home to encourage their father to join them, along with neighbor Theophilus Rees and a group of other Welshmen located in Belleville. In 1801, the elder Phillips and Rees purchased 2,000 acres near what is now Granville and Newark, Licking County, therefore became some of the earliest settlers of Welsh lineage in the county. The next major group to arrive, and one of the first to directly arrive from Wales, were people moving to Ohio rather than settling in other locations first and then moving there, as had been pretty common through the settlement of these frontier territories and eventual states. And this came about because of David Pugh, who left Radnorshire, South Wales in 1801 and arrived the next year to Franklin County to identify and survey military land warrants being held by another Welshman, Dr. Samuel Jones. In 1804, Radnor, as Pugh called the area in honor of his homeland, was ready for settlement, and in a few years, large groups of Welsh families began to arrive. So with all of that, that's kind of where we begin with Ohio as a place where Welsh settlers were now commuting to or leaving to go to. And with that, we want to talk about some specific ones and kind of their journey, at least briefly. 6 years ago, 2018, was the 200th anniversary of the second major group of settlers leaving from South Wales to the New World and settling in Ohio. The first wave of these immigrants arrived in Ohio in 1818, and they were drawn to Ohio's land and promise of a fresh start. This settlement began because of a discussion in a pub in Carmarthen. The unusual situation saw 6 families from the village of Pennant, Cardiganshire, discuss an idea about leaving and picking up and moving to America. They were convinced of this by the owner of the pub, or the landlord, John Jones, who was the expedition's leader. And on April 1st, 1818, this group of around 36 immigrants left Aberavon Harbor bound for Liverpool and then ventured across the Atlantic over the next 7 weeks. These 6 families, and unfortunately we don't have a breakdown of all the names, but we do have the head of household as you describe it. So basically using, the father as the head of the household, it was John Jones, J. Evans, and J as in J, the letter J, Evan Evans, Lewis Davies, William Williams, and Thomas Evans were the families that headed to this new world. And you'll note that there are 3 Evans families, likely all related, in this group. Their destination was originally Paddy's Run to join their former neighbors who had been settling there. That would change after a long and arduous journey across the ocean. As I said, it took about 7 weeks to get across, so you can imagine just how difficult that was. And unfortunately, during that time, they ended up having a child pass away in something which I'm not entirely clear how or the circumstance, but there was mention of a young girl who died on the crossing. They made it to Baltimore and hired wagons to get them to Pittsburgh, and then, traveling through stages, would get to their final destination, they hoped. From Pittsburgh, they traveled to Cincinnati, and from there they would then go north to Paddy's Run. To do this, they bought a flatboat for their journey down the Ohio River. This was something where, for whatever reason, they decided to buy the boat themselves and sail themselves rather than trusting a local to do any of this, which I think is an interesting decision. The information I read kind of made it sound like they were doing it because of the cost, and it was cheaper to buy the boat and do it themselves than rely on other people. And there was a suggestion that they cut corners. So with all that said and done, things did not go very well, as you can imagine. They would take this trip down the Ohio, and because they were unprepared, they weren't ready for the dangers of it, and they eventually ran out of provisions on their way and landed in an area called Gallipolis in Gallia County, where the French inhabitants that were already there welcomed them warmly and tried everything they could to encourage them to settle there instead of Paddy's Run. That night, a fierce storm hit Gallipolis, and in the morning, the boat was apparently nowhere to be found. It's presumed to have broken loose from its moorings during the storm. Some of the residents later speculated that their French hosts may have let the boat go in order to keep the Welsh there, with the intention of increasing their town population and helping to inflate land values, something that would be important, of course, but when we talk about this a little later, seems a bit speculative at best. The boat was, in fact, found a few days later, but by that time, as the story goes, the Welsh women who were in this community rebelled against further travel, declaring that they had already risked their lives and had no intention of going any further. And considering the circumstance and situation that they'd gone through, totally understandable. The additional inducement available to the people that were there was that there was available work on the new roads being built between Gallipolis and Jackson, and that extra financial inducement obviously settled the matter, even though the local area's soil was of a particularly poor quality, making farming more difficult, and thus this allowed this first Welsh settlement in that part of Ohio to be established. And it was because of these settlements that created effectively insular Welsh communities that allowed these communities to thrive in their own way, because you're speaking your own language, you're carrying out your own religion, you have all these things going on that keeps you together, and it's not just one or two people moving into an area where it's largely dominated by another group. You are the dominant group in most cases, so that affects things quite dramatically, as you can imagine. Things had begun to change in the early part of the 19th century as many Welsh people started to move away from the UK to other parts of the English-speaking world. I was going to say other colonies, but by this time, of course, America was its own thing, so there wasn't it wasn't obviously linked to the British Empire anymore. For various reasons, which we'll mention in further detail, but specifically in this case, let's talk a little bit about nonconformists, the religious groups that were forming and becoming quite large in Wales at the time, and how they were influencing things and driving a lot of this agenda to move away from control of the Anglican faith, which had dominated England ever since Henry VIII declared his breakaway from the Catholic Church. These Calvinist religious groups stress piety, thrift, self-reliance, obedience to God as key tenets of the faith. Of course, the Bible being center point to it all. They were growing up with ideals around success, but success that was given to those who earned it. And also that faith blessed you even further if you were doing these things. So as long as you yourself was working towards success, God would bless you with further success, and you would gain even more reward, both in eternal life as well as in the present day. Something that is very, very strong in a lot of Protestant faiths, especially situated in Britain, where this idea of work ethic was key to the establishment of this concept of religious blessings being driven in part by your work ethic and your willingness to drive yourself forward. So the idea of leaving for America, for example, for a better life, and one that allowed you to succeed through your own hard work, would have been attractive and would have been seen as important. So you can imagine most of the early Welsh settlers in Ohio were non-conforming Calvinists. They generally fell into one of three camps. They were either Calvinist Methodists, Baptists, and Congregationalists, and each of these groups had retained some of their Calvinist doctrine and culture. We talked in previous episodes about the foundation of these groups and their influence on Wales in the 18th century, from the expansion of literacy in order to be able to read the Bible to the traveling preachers who went from house to house, community to community, farmhouse to farmhouse, in order to convert as many people as they could. This would drive a lot of this purpose and would be central to quite a lot that went on even into the 1800s. And we'll talk more about this as more actually American created faiths start to head over to the UK and specifically into Wales to try and gain converts, and how that started to influence the growth of those churches and how these people became a part of these faith groups and how that intermingled in kind of their own ideals and concepts about making a better life for themselves. All of these things are definitely a part of the Welsh experience. There's no doubt about it. But it's something to think about because it's important to what was driving most people towards places like Ohio, which seems so remote, seems so isolated, and so very, very far away from family and relationships that they'd already built up in their home communities. Why do you take that risk? Why do you decide to do things like that? Well, in part because you feel driven to it. And we're going to get into that in a bit. So, of course, not only did they see their mission as one of getting a better life for themselves, but also a part of that was taming the wilderness in America, and it was considered almost a sacred God-given duty. It gave them purpose thanks to their doctrinal confidence that God was on their side. They were very willing to take risks needed to make it work and to make the effort they needed to in order to accomplish what they needed to. Especially when you compare the lives they had in Wales at the time, which generally were very much restricted due to either their language, their culture, where they were born, and in part what class structure they were in. Especially in Britain in this period, the Victorian period was notorious for being very stratified and very difficult to move up and down. Although that was changing, it was still very much a case that unless you hit the right sort of birth situation, you weren't going to suddenly run up to aristocracy level just because you made a lot of money, or you couldn't just go and buy land without having the wealth and the ability to, due to your connections to various wealthy landholders. All of these things are important, and all of this drives it. Early Welsh settlers in Ohio were, in fact, almost 75% were from South Wales, especially from the major industrial counties of Glamorgan and Monmouth. This southeast region of Wales had become a vast industrial center for coal mines and blast furnaces and the rolling mills that were dotting across the landscape throughout the 1830s. And it would be an important experience because of the growing industrialization that America will feature in the next century that will see it rise into an industrial powerhouse. So having these people who already had familiarity with all these things helped to bridge that gap, helped and allowed them to quickly jump on board with a lot of this stuff. Cardiganshire, on the other hand, also was a location where a lot of people emigrated from. Relatively high rates of migration from this county is explained thanks to its limited resources being pressured by rising populations and the solid links of information with Cardigan people already living in Ohio. As letters from Welsh settlers in Ohio filtered back to Cardiganshire, more people realized that life in a marginal farming or seasonal labor in Wales did not compare to the life of land ownership and, in quotes, prosperity that they would find in Ohio. Attractive guidebooks for immigrants were written by Cardiganshire-born ministers in America, many of whom were encouraged to make these to influence more people to come so that they would have more congregants and more expansion and more linkages back home to continue this process. A good tour guide, of course, is important, especially a good tour book, which would influence you, tell you how wonderful everything is, how great it was, how mild everything is, how you could just grow and it would grow easily and well. That was something that was quite consistent in these places when they were trying to get more and more population to move there. There was a lot of talk about the milder climate, which was dubious. The idea that growing food was easy, which of course it wasn't. That the economy was great, which it may or may not have been. There was all of these influences to try and get people to come through what amounts to propaganda. And it's something you see across the Western world, and especially in North America during this period and up to and including the early 1900s, where this is still going on. I know in the city that I grew up in, for example, there was a lot of influence and art used to try and show that this massive amount of wheat that was growing everywhere. Meanwhile, industry was happening, and much to the opposition of the way we think now in our environmentally sensitive mindset. One of the things that was used, especially in this early 1900s, to sort of show industry was to put massive clouds of soot in the air in the paintings and the pictures because it showed industry. It showed the continual progress of the area, and so made it more attractive because it said, hey, we have jobs. So that's the kind of thing where you have to measure these kind of against each other, and kind of understand that there was a measure of propaganda going on to try and convince people to move, specifically because it was useful, it was driving the economy, and when you needed that, you definitely wanted to do what you could to influence that. Over time, there would be people who would come from other parts of Wales. For example, Montgomeryshire in the southeast corner of North Wales was actually the most frequent origin for Welsh people in the county's history in Ohio. This is best explained by the fact that around the mid-century, modernization in English textile mills undercut the local cottage woolen producers and caused them to look abroad to maintain their livelihoods, and in some cases become farmers. Again, the attraction to land was definitely a big one. Also, of course, some of these people from this region were influenced by clergymen. I mentioned it a little bit earlier. People like Benjamin Childlaw, who had emigrated to Ohio and returned to Montgomeryshire to encourage more Welsh people to join settlements in Ohio. Again, basically proselytizing to try and get more people to move there. This would be a theme for many Welsh people over the years, for whom the idea of religious worship without persecution would be attractive, even if the promises were not always accurate or even close to what reality came to be. You have to imagine at this time period, even with the weather being slightly cooler than what we live under now, that conditions would not be the same living in Ohio as they would have been in Wales. And I think a lot of people would have been surprised by that, especially the harsh winters combined with the very hot summers, something that you don't usually get in Wales because of the more temperate ocean level climate. And that would have been a big shock to a lot of people. I think even today, people from Britain who moved to places like Ohio or Michigan or any of these Midwestern states, or even in Canada, will comment on the fact that the weather is very different and very up and down, where it isn't so much there, where the average temperature doesn't vary hugely by comparison. So, with all that in mind, there was still the reality that they weren't just moving there in isolation. They weren't moving there as single families or even individuals. They were moving into ethnic enclaves. And because of this, the Welsh language and ethnic and cultural cohesion maintained itself. For at least the first and second generations, Welsh was still important. Most people still would speak Welsh as their first language. Obviously, over time, this changes, and you start to get less and less Welsh being spoken. But the fact remained that there was a reason why it maintained itself. Much like today, if you look at communities where a large proportion of migrants have moved to, all from one country, they will maintain whatever culture and language they brought with them, because it's a lot easier to do when there's a few hundred of you than when there's 3 of you. And you're not facing basically all English speakers. I can note this in friends of mine who moved over from Laos, who lived in a community where it was all Canadian English speakers, and they were the only people from that area. And over time, the kids that were born in Canada didn't speak Laotian other than to their parents. So you can imagine eventually they would just stop speaking it, and their kids definitely wouldn't be speaking it because they would see there to be no reason for it. Now, why do I know this? Well, because my own family moved from Wales speaking Welsh, came to Canada, decided they were not going to speak Welsh anymore. My father knew like 3 words, and I knew none growing up. Why? Because there was no immediate community where you still could speak your language, where you could still experience your culture And so having that in Ohio was massive because it meant these communities clung together in ways that they weren't able to all the time. And because of this, this developed strong kinship and relationships with their neighbors and allowed them to hold their cultural ideas at least through the early part of the 19th century. While we talk about these things, I wanted to bring up the fact that there were factors that definitely pushed them to go and pulled them to go. And we're going to talk about both sides of this. I think, first of all, let's talk about what's pushing the Welsh to Ohio or America, even overall, or Canada or Australia or New Zealand eventually, and all these other places that they end up moving to, South Africa, India. What is driving that? Well, first off, it's economic hardship. In the early 19th century, as we've discussed quite extensively, Wales faced significant economic difficulties. The Industrial Revolution led to a decline in the traditional industries, which were so key to a lot of Welsh communities, from raising wool production, which had been a very key economic driver for Wales for basically a millennia or two, to all of a sudden that being a lot less useful, and cottage industries and trades that normally were a major part of Welsh life disappeared or were negated because of the industrial might and movement. And this influenced agriculture, it influenced so many other things, and it was causing widespread unemployment and poverty, which they've been dealing with quite extensively, and many Welsh families found it increasingly difficult to make a living, thus promoting the idea of seeking opportunity elsewhere would be something that would be a draw. You can imagine, very similarly to the way Ireland saw an exodus of people during the potato famine, and how the treatment of Catholics in the English system also influenced them to leave. All of these things are driving this momentum of people trying to get away from bad times. Also, political unrest in the early 19th century created a lot of drivers for people. Economic and social change, obviously from the rising amount of poor people and the lack of social safety net, led to a lot of demonstrations and unrest, some of which we've brought up recently. And these debates and calls for reform and grievances over land rights and industrial conditions, this all built up a lot of unrest. And a lot of people are going, why am I living here under these conditions, under these circumstances, in this unfair environment, when there's opportunities for me to go elsewhere and have a better life for my family, for my kids, for me? That makes perfect sense. Religious persecution, of course, had always been something of an issue ever since Henry VIII. And so Wales, of course, has a strong tradition of nonconformity that's been built up over the last 100 years, with many Welsh people belonging to dissenting religious groups such as the Methodists, the Baptists, the Calvinists that we mentioned earlier. And religious dissension faced periods of persecution as well as social discrimination. You belong to that church, well, you're not going to get the cushy jobs and the upper management and things of that nature because you aren't us. And this, of course, would push people out. And these reasons are generally something that have made up much of our discussion in this podcast since episode 201, so very long ago now. These factors continue to be reasons why people will leave. But remember, for every push factor, there are also what we call pull factors, or reasons why people want to go somewhere. You can't just push someone out. There's loads of people that live in areas where their situation is not great, where the economy is not great, where your access to financial benefit is not great, where your housing is not. Certainly all of those things are factors that can push you out. But if you have nowhere to go, then there's no reason to leave, even if you could leave. So you have to have something pulling you to a new location, and you have to have a new location to move to, which is also very important. So what is driving that side of it? Well, first of all, economic opportunities. as we mentioned before, economics is always a big issue. Your ability to feed yourself is always a big issue. To house yourself, always a big issue. So the promise of land and economic opportunities in the United States attracted Welsh immigrants, much like it would do in Canada, because the British, in trying to match what was going on in America, started to try and figure out ways of inducing people to come over. The offer of free land was a big inducement. Ohio, with its fertile land and expanding economy, presented an appealing prospect for those seeking to build a new life, far different from just religious exodus, where you have like the Puritans moving on the Mayflower or something along that line, or like being involved with trade companies like the Virginia Company or like the Hudson's Bay Company, for example, where you're purely economically moving. With this year, there's more to it than that. Of course, what we mentioned earlier, the established communities that already existed, the Welsh immigrants were drawn to Ohio simply because not only was it a place where you could get land, but also it was a place where your fellow countrymen were already living. They were encouraging you to move there. They were putting out calls for family members to come, for just local neighbors to come, and they were using inducements to try and convince them to come. If you're living in Merthyr and you're living in what amounts to a slum, the idea of having your own land and your own place to live that you create and you establish and you found, you can see why that's enticing to these people and why that becomes so important. And it's even the case if you look at the farms, which you're restricted because everything around you is already purchased. You can't go out and just expand and expand and expand. And so your income level is limited. And when you're reliant, as you are at this stage in the history of our world, on your own agriculture to make a living, to feed yourself, that is critical. The more land you have, the easier it is to do, and hopefully to avoid, cycles of drought and starvation. All of these things are important. So the inducement to come, the free land, the free ability to build and have what you want becomes an enticement. It's a big one. And then on top of it, to come to a community where other people are speaking your language, they all know the same things, they all sing the same hymns, they all experience the same perspective on life. Again, big inducement. Big inducement. And finally, and we've mentioned it numerous times in this, is the fact that the United States government and various states had started to offer land grants and other incentives to attract settlers to the frontier. These opportunities were particularly attractive to those who had struggled with land ownership and economic stability in their homeland. Makes perfect sense, correct? Why wouldn't you under those circumstances? These are the meat and potatoes of why people generally move. And add to this, as author William Van Vogt points out, and I will say, I used his book quite a lot for this particular episode because it was so good. It's called British Buckeyes. It is a very good book and does actually talk a lot about this. And if you're interested in more about this, certainly read it because there's lots to it. But he says, the Welsh felt at home in their hilly regions in Ohio, which resembled their old homeland. They were experienced with the challenges of farming such land, and they considered them healthier than the flat lowlands and swamp areas where the water stagnated and produced malaria. Besides, the fertile flatlands were often too expensive and already purchased by other settlers. The Welsh generally settled in the southeastern part of Ohio, in places like Gallia County, as we mentioned earlier, and were instrumental in developing what became known as the Welsh Hills region. They established tight-knit communities and brought with them traditional practices, founded churches, schools, and other cultural institutions which would influence Ohio for many years to come. These key settlements of Gallia County and Welsh Hills were important because, like I said, it established wealth identity. It established the idea of a community built on that. And even today, there is Welsh people who maintain museums and historical buildings in these areas that mark the influence of Wales on the community. And it's something that you can even find online. Like I looked at the Welsh Museum there. Very interesting and fascinating stuff. You can see how the cultural and religious life continued and how they continued to maintain their attachment to Wales, even though they were living in a very different location, in a very different place, with very different factors affecting them. All of these things, of course, would mean that the Welsh settlers contributed significantly to Ohio's economic development. They were involved in its agriculture, mining, and later manufacturing. Their hard work and entrepreneurial spirit helped drive local economies and contribute to the state's growth. These communities were characterized by what was called strong social cohesion and mutual support, and this sense of community provided a foundation for future generations to thrive and help preserve Welsh traditions and identity in a new country. And that is something that is important. If you look, even today, there are Welsh societies in North America and other places where they moved. They didn't go away. They still are there, and you can still find them, and they still host cultural events that are important to Welsh communities in North America. And I would encourage you, if you live in North America, to check them out because they are around. Today, that legacy is evident through these sites, through these various cultural events, and organizations continue these festivals. They continue to celebrate and preserve the heritage of these early settlers, and the impact of Welsh migration is a testament to the diverse influence that shaped the history of that state. And because of this, they are remembered. And it's something to keep in mind that that's not always the case. A lot of times when you look at the emigration of Welsh people to certain areas, because sometimes they're not in communities, there isn't like a massive migration of 40, 50, 100 people to an area that then grows to 6,000 or 7,000 people. There's not this same linkages in the same way because of it. There are loads of people who have ancestry from Wales who lived and grew up in North America, in Australia, in New Zealand, in South Africa, and many other places who don't have that same connection, don't have that same cultural linkage, trying to maintain an important cultural touchstone to the history of your country, to the history of Wales, and it links back to so many people both in Wales and outside of Wales. You know, your history doesn't end at the edge of a border, and it's important to remember that. So without a lot of moralizing, I just wanted to kind of reinforce that. I wanted to talk about this because I found it fascinating just how much there was in Ohio that was developed, that there is these things like, and they're not just in Ohio, there's other places. There's, you know, events that are held that are kind of North American wide, that are held in various facilities across North America. And it's interesting to someone like myself who didn't know about them to find out about these and realize that there are people that, just like yourself, if you're one of them, is and are maintaining and upholding these things. And I think that's important. And I think it's a significant challenge to do. So I commend them for that, because I think it does leave a strong legacy for future generations. So with that, I'd like to thank you guys all for watching and listening today. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, you can either reach out to me through the comments on YouTube, through my email at welshhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can reach out to me on Twitter/X, if you want to call it that, at Welsh History Pod, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. Or if you'd like to, like a few of you do, help me with the funding of this podcast, especially around research, such as this book on Ohio history. I've got another one on Iowa. I'm going to try and collect as many as I can find, as long as they're well done. I think they're good to have in the bank. We're definitely, anybody wondering, we are going to talk about Patagonia eventually too. So, you know, I'm not skipping them. They're just later on. And you can always help out at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you everyone for listening and or watching today. Thank you so much for everything you do for this podcast, in supporting us, in sending feedback, positive or critiquing things. It is appreciated. And certainly I don't like to make mistakes. Sometimes we do. I should mention, by the way, I should have mentioned this at the off, that I made a mistake last week in talking about the Braveheart. It was Sterling Bridge. I don't know why I said Stanford. got it totally wrong. But anyway, with all that said and done, thank you very much for listening. And as I said, watching. We'll talk to you later. Take care. Goodbye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.